Security, revoke her access. Ethan didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. The words landed clean and cold, slicing through the open office like a line of code that executed without error, and Ava Johnson felt it before she fully understood it. A quiet shift in the air as her screen flickered once, twice, then went black mid-line, the cursor disappearing like it had never been there at all, and for a second no one moved. Not the developers hunched over dual monitors, not the product manager frozen halfway through a sentence, not even the low hum of the servers in the glass-walled room beyond them seemed to change. Everything just paused, like the system itself was holding its breath, and Ava sat there with her hands still hovering over the keyboard, fingertips warm against plastic keys that no longer responded, her reflection faint in the darkened screen, eyes steady, not wide, not panicked, just still, as if she had expected something like this, even if not this exact moment, even if not this abruptly. Across the room, Ethan Cole finally looked up from his laptop, his expression composed, almost bored, the kind of calm that came from being the person everyone else deferred to. We don't have time for unnecessary complexity, he added, more to the room than to her, though the weight of it settled squarely on her shoulders, and a few heads nodded, quick, automatic, the kind of agreement that wasn't really agreement at all, just habit, just gravity pulling everything toward the same center. Ava lowered her hands slowly, folding them in her lap, her badge, temporary, white with a thin blue stripe, resting against her hoodie, slightly crooked from where it had caught on the edge of her desk earlier, and she glanced once at the empty space where her code had been, not scrolling, not saved, just gone from her access. And then she looked up, past the rows of monitors, past the glass reflections and fluorescent light, toward Ethan. The failsafe isn't fully integrated yet, she said, her voice even, not loud, not soft, just precise, like she was stating a fact that didn't need emphasis. And for a moment it seemed like the words might hang there, like they might register, but Ethan's attention had already shifted back to his screen. We're past that, he replied, almost absent-mindedly, fingers already moving again, and someone nearby let out a small chuckle, not mean, just dismissive, the kind of sound that erased things. Ava nodded once, a small motion, almost invisible, and turned back to her blank screen, the faint reflection of overhead lights tracing across it in long white bars, like lines of code she couldn't touch anymore. And in that reflection, she could see herself sitting at the edge of the team, physically and otherwise, her desk tucked beside the printer station, where warm paper still slid out in soft bursts every few minutes, the smell of toner faint but constant, a reminder of where she fit in the layout of things, temporary, peripheral, replaceable, and yet her mind kept tracking the system in the background, the architecture she had mapped out over late nights and early mornings, the pieces she had stitched together quietly, while everyone else focused on the visible layers, the parts that would be presented, demoed, applauded. She thought about the fallback routines still sitting incomplete, about the conditional triggers that hadn't been fully wired into the main deployment path, about the one key she hadn't committed because she'd been waiting for review that never came. And she felt a small, steady pressure build in her chest, not panic, not anger, just awareness, like watching a storm form miles away on a clear horizon, knowing exactly how it would move, exactly what it would touch, and exactly when it would arrive, even as everyone else kept working like the sky above them would never change. And behind her, the glass server room lights blinked in quiet rhythm, green, 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 steady for now. Go live in 60 seconds, Megan Ross said, her voice cutting clean through the low hum of the office as if she were calling out a boarding group at an airport, controlled, efficient, already moving on to the next step before the last one had settled, and screens across the floor shifted in unison, dashboards loading, progress bars inching forward in neat, confident lines, while Ava remained seated, hands folded loosely, watching without touching, the absence of access more noticeable now that everything around her was accelerating. And on the central display mounted above the glass wall, the deployment sequence began to scroll, line after line of system checks turning green, each one a quiet confirmation that the team had done this before, that this was routine, that nothing unexpected was supposed to happen here. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, one arm resting on the backrest, eyes scanning the metrics with the calm of someone who had already decided the outcome. "This is what happens when you keep it simple," he said, not looking at anyone in particular. But the words landed like a summary, like a conclusion that had already been reached, and a few people nodded again, subtle, almost invisible, while someone at the far end of the row whispered, "Clean rollout," under their breath, as if saying it softly would keep it true, and Ava's gaze drifted to the numbers, the response times, the request queues, the thin blue lines that represented user activity beginning to climb as the system opened to the public. Everything looked smooth, almost too smooth, like a surface stretched tight over something still settling underneath, and she noticed it then, not a failure, not even an error, just a slight hesitation in one of the service calls, a delay measured in fractions of a second, the kind of thing most people would never see. But to her it stood out, a small irregularity in an otherwise perfect pattern, like a heartbeat skipping once before returning to rhythm. She shifted slightly in her chair, leaning forward just enough to see the secondary logs on a nearby monitor that still had visibility, not her terminal, but enough to read. Enough to confirm what she already suspected: the fallback routine had not engaged, not because it failed, but because it had never been connected, the conditional trigger still pointing to a path that did not exist in this build. And for a moment she considered saying something again, considered breaking the surface one more time, but the room had already moved past listening, already committed to the narrative of success, and the next set of checks turned green, one after another. The progress bar reaching 100% with a soft chime that sounded almost celebratory. "We are live," Megan announced, and a few light claps followed, brief, polite, quickly fading as people returned to their screens, refreshing dashboards, watching traffic increase, watching numbers validate the decision that had just been made. Ethan gave a small nod, satisfied. "Monitor for anomalies, but we are good," he said, already opening another tab, already thinking about the next phase, and for a stretch of seconds everything held, stable, controlled, the kind of quiet that comes after a successful launch. And then, almost imperceptibly, one of the graphs dipped, not sharply, just a slight curve downward before correcting itself, a ripple that passed through the data and disappeared so quickly it could be dismissed as noise. Except Ava did not dismiss it. Her eyes followed the pattern as it reappeared in another metric. Then another, small inconsistencies threading through the system, like fine cracks beneath polished glass. And somewhere deep in the server room, unseen behind the reflective panels, a single status light shifted from steady green to a softer, pulsing shade, easy to miss unless you were looking for it. And Ava sat back slowly, her expression unchanged, but her attention sharpened. The storm she had sensed earlier now closer, not loud, not obvious, but moving with quiet certainty. While around her the team continued to work under the assumption that everything was still exactly as it appeared. The first alert did not sound like an alarm. It sounded like a hesitation, a soft chime from somewhere in the system that did not belong to any critical failure, just a notification that something had taken longer than expected, and most of the room ignored it the same way people ignore a flickering light that still works. But Ava heard it, not with her ears, but in the pattern of the data, in the way the response time graph did not return fully to baseline, in the way one service call repeated itself once before resolving, a duplication that should not exist in a clean deployment. She leaned slightly to the right, catching a clearer view of a shared monitor where logs continued to stream in thin white text against a dark background, timestamps stacking in precise order. Except now there were tiny gaps, milliseconds stretched just enough to matter, just enough to signal that the system was beginning to compensate for something it did not fully understand. "We are seeing a minor delay on the East Region cluster," someone said from across the room, their tone casual, almost dismissive, like they were commenting on traffic rather than infrastructure. Ethan did not turn. "Autoscaling will handle it," he replied, fingers still moving, confident, controlled, the assumption of redundancy built into every word. And for a moment it seemed like he might be right. The system did respond, spinning up additional instances, distributing load, smoothing the curve back toward normal, but the correction came with a cost, one that was not immediately visible on the primary dashboards. Only in the deeper layers where Ava's attention had already settled, the fail-safe logic that should have absorbed the imbalance was not there, which meant the system was solving problems by creating new ones, redirecting pressure instead of releasing it, like pushing water from one side of a glass to the other without realizing the glass was already full. She exhaled slowly, steady, controlled, her mind mapping the chain reaction as it formed, each service depending on another, each delay cascading into the next, not dramatic, not explosive, just incremental, precise, inevitable. And then a second alert appeared, this one sharper, highlighted in yellow on the central display. A latency spike crossing a predefined threshold, not critical yet, but no longer invisible. Megan glanced up this time, her posture tightening slightly. That is higher than expected, she said, and a few more heads turned, attention beginning to shift, but still not alarm. Not yet. Ethan finally paused, eyes scanning the screen, calculating. It is within tolerance, he said after a beat, though his voice had lost a fraction of its earlier ease, just enough to register if you were listening for it. And Ava was. She watched as the system attempted another correction, rerouting requests, increasing throughput, but without the fail-safe integration, the adjustments began to overlap, creating brief collisions in the data flow, requests waiting on responses that arrived just a fraction too late, queues building in places that were supposed to remain empty. And then, almost quietly, a third alert surfaced, this one in orange, not loud, not flashing, but present, undeniable. The kind of signal that changed the temperature of a room without anyone announcing it. Conversation slowed, keyboards paused, and for the first time since the launch, the steady rhythm of the office broke into uneven beats. Ethan leaned forward now, both hands on the desk, eyes fixed on the metrics as if willing them to stabilize. Check the rollback conditions, he said, sharper this time, more directive, and someone nearby pulled up the configuration, scrolling quickly, scanning lines that should have been familiar, and then stopping, just for a second, a hesitation that mirrored the system itself. The rollback path is not responding, they said, quieter now, the words landing heavier than they sounded, and Ava closed her eyes briefly, not in frustration, not in fear, just in recognition. The moment she had seen coming now fully in motion, the storm no longer distant, no longer forming, but arriving, steady and certain, while the room around her shifted from confidence to confusion in slow, measurable steps. Why is the rollback not responding? Ethan said, and this time it was not a statement. It was a question that carried weight, sharp enough to cut through the room, and no one answered immediately, not because they did not hear him, but because every screen in front of them was beginning to tell a different version of the same story, numbers drifting out of alignment, response times stretching past acceptable limits, cues forming where there should have been none, and the soft, controlled rhythm of the office had fractured into uneven bursts of typing, chairs shifting, voices lowering into quick, tense exchanges. Megan stepped closer to the central display, arms crossed tightly now, eyes scanning faster. We are getting increased error rates from multiple endpoints, she said, her tone no longer neutral, and the word multiple hung there longer than it should have, because it meant the issue was not isolated. It was spreading, and on the far wall the once steady green indicators had begun to change, one turning yellow, then another, a slow transition that felt almost polite, as if the system itself was trying not to alarm them too quickly, but the pattern was unmistakable, and Ava watched it all from her seat, still, quiet, her hands resting lightly on her lap, while inside her mind the connections were already fully formed, each failure tracing back to the same missing piece, the same absence that no one had acknowledged when it mattered. Check the fail-safe routing. Someone called out, their voice tighter now, and another engineer pulled up the configuration, scrolling rapidly, eyes darting across lines that suddenly looked unfamiliar. It is not here, he said, almost under his breath, as if saying it louder would make it more real. Ethan turned sharply. What do you mean it is not there? And for the first time there was an edge in his voice that did not belong to authority, but to uncertainty. And the engineer swallowed, pointing at the screen. The conditional trigger is missing. It is not connected to the deployment path. And a brief silence followed. Not the calm silence from earlier, but something heavier, something that pressed against the walls of the room. And Ava's gaze lifted slightly, just enough to meet the reflection of the central display in the glass. the flickering colors now breaking across her face in shifting tones, and she remembered the exact moment she had written that trigger. Late at night, the office nearly empty, the hum of the printers gone, the lights dimmed to half power, her fingers moving steadily as she built the logic that would catch what others did not anticipate, not because anyone asked her to, but because she saw the gap, and now that gap was no longer theoretical, it was active, expanding, the system trying to correct itself without the structure it needed, pushing load across services that were not prepared to receive it, amplifying delays into failures. And then the next alert came, louder this time. A red marker flashing on the central display, not constant, but pulsing, like a warning that refused to be ignored. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, heads turned in unison, and even the distant hum of the servers seemed to shift, a deeper tone settling into the background. Ethan stepped forward, both hands now braced against the desk, eyes locked on the data. "Find the missing link," he said, each word measured, controlled. But beneath it there was something else now, something that had not been there before, and around him the team moved faster, searching, cross-checking, trying to trace back through decisions that had already been made, while Ava remained exactly where she was, her presence quiet, almost invisible, except for the one thing no one had connected yet, the one detail that sat just outside their line of sight, waiting to be seen. "Trace every dependency back," Ethan said, and now there was no space left in his voice for assumptions. Only urgency sharpened into control, and the room responded instantly, chairs pulling closer to desks, fingers moving faster across keyboards, multiple screens splitting into layers of logs, metrics, and configurations as if the system could be solved by looking at it from enough angles at once. And yet the more they searched, the more the problem seemed to slip sideways, not hidden, just unrecognized, like a missing piece everyone had stepped around without noticing. "Error rates are climbing," Megan added, her eyes fixed on the central display where the red indicators no longer pulsed gently, but appeared in clusters, spreading across services that had been stable just minutes ago. And somewhere in the back, someone muttered, "This does not make sense," the words barely audible, but carrying the weight of something breaking beneath the surface. Ava remained still, her posture unchanged, but her attention followed every shift, every failed attempt to stabilize, mapping the chain reaction as it widened, requests stacking faster than they could be processed, fallback attempts failing silently because they had nowhere to route, the system trying to protect itself without the structure that had been designed for that exact moment. And then a voice near the center of the room spoke up, hesitant at first. "Wait," he said, scrolling back through a configuration file, eyes narrowing as if focusing harder might change what he was saying. "This section, it references a module that is not in this build." And that was it, the smallest crack widening just enough for recognition to begin. Ethan turned, sharp. "What module?" And the engineer hesitated, not because he did not know, but because saying it would connect threads that had been kept separate until now. "The failsafe handler," he said, more clearly this time, and the room shifted, not physically, but in awareness, heads turning slightly, attention redirecting, the shape of the problem finally taking form. "Who was working on that?" Megan asked, her voice steady but tighter than before, and for a second no one answered, not because the answer was unknown, but because it had not mattered until now, until this exact moment. And then someone at the far end said it, quietly, almost like a correction to a detail that should have been obvious. "Ava." And the name settled into the room with a different kind of weight. Not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable. And Ethan did not respond immediately, his eyes flicking across the screens again as if searching for confirmation in the data before accepting it. But the pattern was already there. The missing trigger, the absent routing, the gap that connected every failure back to a single point of origin. And for the first time since the system had gone live, his gaze shifted away from the metrics, away from the dashboards, and toward the edge of the room where Ava still sat, quiet, composed, her screen dark, her hands resting lightly in her lap, not typing, not reacting, just present. And the contrast was sharp now, between the chaos unfolding across the system and the stillness around her. And in that stillness was something the room had overlooked, not because it was hidden, but because it had never been given weight, never been treated as essential. And Ethan straightened slightly, his expression tightening not with anger, but with realization forming too late. While the alerts continued to stack, red over orange over yellow, the system no longer drifting but sliding, each second adding pressure that could not be redirected, and Ava finally lifted her gaze fully, meeting the reflection of the room in the glass before letting her eyes settle forward, calm, steady, as if she had already decided what this moment meant long before anyone else had recognized it. "Call her back," Megan said, the words landing softer than the urgency behind them. But they cut through the noise all the same, and for a moment no one moved, as if the idea itself needed a second to settle into a room that had already decided she did not belong there. Ethan remained still, his eyes fixed on the central display where the red indicators continued to spread, but the focus in his gaze had shifted, no longer scanning for solutions within the system, but tracing backward, recalculating decisions that had already been made. "Her access is revoked," someone replied from the side, fingers still moving across a keyboard, trying to stabilize something that no longer responded the way it should, and the statement hung there, factual, procedural, but suddenly insufficient. Megan turned slightly, her voice firmer now. "Then restore it." And the simplicity of the instruction exposed the complexity beneath it, permissions, approvals, protocols that had been executed cleanly just minutes ago now standing in the way of reversing a mistake. And across the room another alert flashed, brighter, sharper, the system no longer masking its strain, queues backing up faster than they could be cleared, response times stretching beyond thresholds that were no longer theoretical, and Ava watched all of it without moving, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged, but inside her mind the sequence was precise. The points of failure no longer potential but active, each one aligning with what she had anticipated, what she had tried to say in a single quiet sentence that had not been heard. And now the room was louder, not in volume, but in motion, overlapping voices, quick commands, the sound of keys striking faster, harder, as if speed alone could correct what structure could not. Ethan finally turned fully, his gaze landing on Ava with a clarity that had not been there before, not dismissive, not distracted, but direct, and for a second the distance between them felt measured, not in feet, but in everything that had been overlooked. "Ava," he said, her name deliberate, precise, as if saying it correctly might restore something beyond access. And she met his gaze without hesitation, calm, steady, not defiant, not yielding, just present. "We need the fail-safe," he continued, the words controlled, but the urgency beneath them no longer hidden, and around them the system continued to shift. Another service failing to respond, another metric slipping out of range, the quiet hum of the servers now carrying a deeper tone, like pressure building behind a closed door. Ava's eyes moved briefly past him, to the screens, to the data she could read even without direct access, confirming what she already knew, the window for a clean correction narrowing with every second, and then back to him, her voice even, measured. "It was not deployed," she said, not as an accusation, not as a defense, just as a fact. And Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, the truth of it landing without resistance because the system itself was proving it in real time. "Can you fix it?" he asked, and this time there was no pretense, no layer of authority to soften the request, just a direct question from someone who had run out of alternatives. And for a moment the room seemed to quiet around that exchange, not completely, but enough for the shift to be felt, the balance of control tilting in a way no one had planned for. Ava did not answer immediately, not because she did not know, but because the question carried more than its surface. It carried everything that had happened before this moment, everything that had been dismissed, overlooked, removed, and she looked down briefly at her dark screen, the reflection of the overhead lights stretching across it in thin white lines. Then back up, her expression unchanged, her voice steady. "I can stabilize it," she said, choosing each word with care, "but I will need access." And the conditions settled into the room with quiet finality, simple, clear, and suddenly more important than any metric on the screen, while behind them the system continued to strain, waiting for a decision that could no longer be delayed. No one argued after that, not because there was no protocol left to follow, but because the system itself had stripped the room down to what mattered, and Megan was already moving, her voice quick and precise. Restore her credentials, full access, now. And somewhere behind Ava, a keyboard shifted direction, commands reversing earlier decisions, permissions being rebuilt layer by layer. While on the central display, another cluster of red indicators appeared, closer together this time, less patient, and Ethan did not look away from Ava as he added, "Give her whatever she needs." The words direct, unfiltered, carrying none of the distance they had before, and for a moment the entire room seemed to pivot around that exchange. Attention no longer scattered across screens, but anchored to a single point. A single person who had been sitting just outside their focus minutes ago, and Ava waited, not moving toward the keyboard yet, her gaze steady, as if the timing mattered, as if acting too soon without the right conditions would only add to the instability already spreading through the system. "Access is coming through," someone said, their voice tight with concentration, and Ava turned slightly, her fingers brushing the edge of the desk as she pulled the keyboard closer, the surface cool beneath her hands, familiar despite the interruption, and then her screen flickered once, twice, before lighting back up, not fully, not yet, but enough to show the terminal window. Reappearing, the cursor blinking again, small, steady, like a heartbeat returning after being held too long, and she inhaled quietly. The motion subtle, almost invisible, but it grounded her, brought everything back into alignment, while around her the room continued to move, voices overlapping, updates being called out. But now there was a different tone beneath it, not confidence, not control, but expectation, as if everyone understood that the next few moments would define everything that followed. Ava's eyes moved quickly across the logs, not reading line by line but absorbing patterns, confirming what had changed since she last had access. The delays now measurable in full seconds, the cues no longer temporary but sustained, and the absence of the fail-safe logic creating gaps where the system should have adapted. She began typing, not fast, not rushed, but precise, each keystroke deliberate, rebuilding the pathway she had designed, reconnecting the trigger conditions to the active deployment, her focus narrowing to the code, to the structure beneath the noise, while the screens around her continued to flash with warnings, the contrast sharp between the urgency of the room and the steadiness of her movements. Ethan remained standing where he was, watching, not interfering, his hands still, his usual control replaced by something quieter, something closer to observation, and for a brief second, as Ava paused to verify a sequence, the room seemed to hold again, not in ignorance this time, but in awareness. Every person there understanding that they were waiting on something they had dismissed before, something that had been present the entire time, just not recognized for what it was. Routing path reestablished, Ava said softly, more to the system than to the room. And then she continued, layering the final connections, the fail-safe logic sliding into place like a missing piece that had always belonged there. And as she worked, the central display shifted almost imperceptibly, one of the red indicators fading back to orange, then another stabilizing just enough to stop pulsing, small changes, not a full recovery, but enough to signal that the direction had changed, that the system was no longer drifting without structure, and Ava did not look up, did not acknowledge the shift. She simply kept typing, steady, focused, as if the outcome was not a question, only a matter of completing what had already been started. The change did not arrive all at once. It came in layers, subtle at first, almost easy to doubt if you were not watching closely. But Ava saw it immediately in the way the logs began to realign, timestamps tightening, delays shrinking from full seconds back into fractions, the system no longer pushing blindly against itself, but beginning to breathe again, controlled, measured, and she kept her focus locked on the terminal, fingers moving with quiet precision, adjusting thresholds, reconnecting dependencies that had been left exposed, each command placed exactly where it needed to be, not rushed, not hesitant, while behind her the room shifted in response, voices lowering, movements slowing just enough to follow what was happening rather than chase it. Latency is dropping, someone said, this time not as a question, but as a realization, and Megan stepped closer to the central display, her arms no longer crossed, her posture leaning forward as if drawn in by the data itself. Error rates are stabilizing, she added, the words carrying a cautious relief that had not existed minutes before. and on the wall the red indicators began to recede, not disappearing instantly, but fading, one by one, into orange, then yellow, the system shedding its strain in visible stages, and Ethan remained where he was, his attention fixed not on the screens now, but on Ava, watching the way she worked, the steadiness of her movements, the absence of panic in a moment that had overwhelmed everyone else. And there was something different in his expression, not just recognition, but recalibration, as if he were seeing the same situation through a lens he had not considered before. Ava paused briefly, scanning a set of logs that had just refreshed, her eyes narrowing slightly as she confirmed the final sequence. The fail-safe logic now fully integrated, active, responding to fluctuations the way it had been designed to, absorbing pressure instead of redirecting it. And then she typed the last command, a small, controlled action that carried the weight of everything that had led to this point. And for a second, nothing seemed to change, the room, holding its breath again. But this time the silence felt different, not uncertain, but expectant. And then the central display shifted, the remaining orange indicators smoothing into yellow, the graphs leveling out, response times returning to baseline, steady, consistent, and the low hum of the servers settled back into its original rhythm, even, unstrained, as if the system itself had exhaled. "We are back within normal parameters," someone said, the words clear, confirmed by the data in front of them, and a quiet ripple moved through the room. Not applause, not celebration, just a release of tension that had built without anyone fully acknowledging it. And Ava leaned back slightly in her chair, her hands resting again, her screen still active now, the cursor blinking steadily at the end of a completed line, and she glanced once more at the metrics, not to admire the result, but to ensure it held, to confirm that the structure she had rebuilt would continue to support what came next. And around her the team began to return to their stations, slower this time, more deliberate, the earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, something more aware, while Ethan finally looked back at the central display, taking in the stabilized system, the absence of red, the restored balance, and then back to Ava. The distance between them no longer defined by roles or assumptions, but by a moment that had shifted everything without a single raised voice. For a few seconds after the system stabilized, no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the room was still adjusting to the absence of pressure, the sudden quiet feeling almost unfamiliar after the steady rise of tension that had filled every corner just moments before, and the screens reflected it clearly, clean lines returning, steady metrics holding their shape without fluctuation. The kind of stability that did not demand attention anymore, and yet no one looked away. Right away, as if they needed to see it continue, to trust that it would not slip again. "Everything is holding," Megan said finally, her voice lower now, grounded, the urgency gone but replaced with something more deliberate, and a few heads nodded, slower this time, not automatic, but thoughtful, as if each person was replaying the last 10 minutes in their mind, tracing back where things had turned, where they had missed what was right in front of them. And Ava remained seated, her posture unchanged, her hands resting lightly near the keyboard, her eyes still scanning the logs, not out of doubt, but out of habit, ensuring the system continued to behave the way it was designed to. And then she typed a final check, a quiet verification that returned clean, confirming what the room was already beginning to accept, and she leaned back slightly, the movement small, but signaling completion, not in a dramatic way, just a natural end to a process that had been interrupted and then restored. Ethan exhaled slowly, a breath he had been holding longer than he realized, his shoulders lowering just enough to show it. And he looked again at the display, then back at Ava, the connection between the two no longer abstract, no longer theoretical, but clear, direct, and undeniable. "You built that entire failsafe," he said, not as a question, but as a statement he was still catching up to. And Ava met his gaze, calm, steady. "Yes," she answered, without emphasis, without pride, just the truth. And for a moment the simplicity of it seemed to carry more weight than anything else that had happened, because it exposed not just the technical gap, but the human one, the space where her work had existed without recognition, where her voice had been present but not heard. And Ethan nodded once, slower this time, as if acknowledging something larger than the system in front of him. "We should have reviewed it," he said, the words quiet, almost to himself, but loud enough to be heard, and no one responded, not because they disagreed, but because there was nothing to add, the evidence of that mistake still fresh on every screen, and Ava glanced briefly at the central display again. The stabilized metrics, the absence of red, the quiet rhythm restored, and then back to her terminal, where the cursor blinked. Patiently, waiting for the next input, and she did not type. Not immediately, because for the first time since the moment her access had been revoked, there was no immediate action required, no correction to make, just a stillness that allowed everything to settle. And around her the team began to move again, but differently now. More aware, more measured, conversations quieter, eyes lingering a second longer on the details they might have overlooked before, and Ethan remained standing for a moment longer before finally pulling a chair closer, sitting down without taking his eyes off the system, but also not ignoring the person who had just held it together. The balance of the room shifted in a way that did not need to be announced, and Ava sat there within it, unchanged on the surface, but no longer invisible. The room did not return to what it had been before, even as the system settled into a steady rhythm, because something else had shifted beneath the surface, something less visible than metrics but harder to ignore, and Ethan felt it as he sat there, eyes on the stabilized dashboards, knowing that the numbers in front of him were only part of what had just been restored, the rest sitting quietly across the room, hands folded, screen active, waiting without asking for recognition, and for a moment he said nothing, not because there were no words, but because the ones that came first did not feel sufficient. "We are running post-incident checks," Megan said, her voice steady again, but slower now, each word placed with more care, and the team followed, opening reports, validating logs, confirming that what had been fixed would hold under continued load. Yet even in that movement there was hesitation, a subtle pause before each action, as if everyone was recalibrating how they approached what they thought they already understood. Ethan finally leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk, eyes still on the data but his voice directed elsewhere. "Ava," he said again, and this time there was no command in it, no urgency, just a call for attention, and she looked up, meeting his gaze with the same calm steadiness she had carried through everything. "Stay on the system for the next cycle," he continued, choosing his words carefully. "I want your oversight on all fallback logic," and the request landed differently than anything that had come before it. Not a correction, not a temporary fix, but a shift in role, subtle but clear, and Ava held his gaze for a moment, as if measuring the weight of what was being asked, not in terms of authority, but in terms of trust. "I will monitor it," she said, her voice even, without hesitation, and then she turned back to her screen, not waiting for acknowledgement, not seeking it, just continuing the work that needed to be done. And Ethan watched that for a second longer before nodding slightly, more to himself than to anyone else, while across the room the team moved through their checks with a different awareness, calling out updates in quieter tones, double-checking assumptions that would have gone unquestioned earlier, and on the central display the system held steady, lines smooth, indicators calm, the earlier chaos now reduced to a record in the logs, something that could be reviewed, analyzed, explained, but not undone. And Megan stepped closer to Ethan, lowering her voice just enough to separate it from the rest of the room. "We need to document this," she said. "What failed and why?" And Ethan nodded, eyes still forward. "We will," he replied, but his attention drifted briefly back to Ava, to the way she worked without drawing attention, without changing pace, as if nothing about the situation had altered her approach, and that contrast stayed with him, sharper than any metric on the screen, because it revealed something he had overlooked, not just in the system, but in the structure of the team itself. And as the minutes passed, the office settled into a new rhythm, one that looked similar on the surface, screens glowing, keys tapping, voices exchanging information. But underneath it there was a shift, a quiet recognition that something essential had been ignored and then proven in the most undeniable way, and Ava remained at her desk within that space, no longer at the edge of it, her presence now part of the system in a way that did not require explanation, only acknowledgement. The system held steady through the next cycle, not perfectly, but predictably, and that difference mattered, Because predictability meant control, and control meant the pressure that had filled the room earlier no longer dictated every movement. Yet the silence that followed was not empty. It carried a weight that had not been there before, something unspoken but present in the way people glanced at their screens a second longer, in the way conversations started and stopped with more care, and Ava remained focused, her eyes moving across the logs with quiet precision, confirming that each layer she had restored continued to respond as intended, her hands resting near the keyboard but not rushing to act. Because now the system was no longer reacting blindly. It was adapting, the way it had been designed to from the beginning, and Ethan watched that from across the desk, his attention shifting between the stabilized data and the person who had made it possible, the connection no longer abstract, no longer something he could dismiss as incidental. Ava, he said again after a moment, his voice lower, more deliberate, and when she looked up, he held her gaze longer this time, not out of authority, but out of acknowledgement. You could have walked out, he added, the statement simple, but carrying the weight of everything that had happened before she was asked to return. And for a second the room seemed to quiet again, not completely, but enough for the words to settle, and Ava considered it, not visibly, not with any dramatic shift, just a brief pause where her eyes softened slightly, reflecting something internal rather than reactive. Yes, she said, her voice calm, not defensive, not proud, just honest, and Ethan nodded once, as if confirming something he already understood but needed to hear. But you did not, he continued, and this time it sounded less like a question and more like a realization forming out loud, and Ava's gaze moved briefly back to the screen, to the steady metrics, the users behind them who would never see the failure that had almost happened, who would never know how close the system had come to breaking, under its own weight, and then back to him. The system does not belong to one person, she said quietly, each word measured, and neither does the responsibility. And the simplicity of it shifted something in the room again, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to be felt, because it reframed what had just happened, not as a personal victory, not as a correction of a mistake, but as a choice, one that extended beyond titles and decisions and into something more fundamental. And Ethan looked at her for a moment longer before glancing back at the display, the steady lines, the absence of alerts, the quiet confirmation that things were holding, and he exhaled slowly, not in relief this time, but in recognition, while Megan, standing nearby, observed the exchange without interrupting, her posture relaxed now, but her attention sharp, as if taking in more than just the technical outcome. And around them the team continued their work, but the tone had shifted, questions asked more openly, answers given with more space. The earlier certainty replaced by something closer to awareness, and Ava turned back to her screen, her fingers resting lightly on the keyboard again, ready to act if needed, but not driven by urgency anymore, just by the steady rhythm of maintaining something that mattered. And in that quiet continuity, the difference between what had been assumed and what had been proven remained, not spoken aloud, but present in every glance, every pause, every decision that followed. The office lights felt different now, not brighter, not dimmer, but steadier, as if the tension that had flickered through the room earlier had finally settled into something calm and grounded, and Ava sat in that quiet shift without changing her posture, her screen reflecting clean lines of data that no longer demanded urgent correction, just attention, just care, and her fingers moved occasionally, small adjustments, routine checks, nothing dramatic, nothing visible enough to draw attention, yet everything essential to keeping the system balanced. And across the room Ethan stood slowly, the movement unhurried, deliberate, as if he were stepping into a space that had changed while he was still trying to understand it. He walked a few steps closer, not all the way, not crossing into her space, but enough to remove the distance that had once made it easy to overlook her. And for a moment he did not speak, his eyes resting on the active terminal, the steady flow of logs, the quiet proof of something that no longer needed to prove itself. "We are updating the deployment structure," he said finally, his voice even, but carrying a different kind of weight now, not authority, but intention. "Your failsafe will be integrated as a core layer, not optional." And the words landed without ceremony, but they shifted something in the room, subtle, permanent, like a line being redrawn. and Ava glanced up briefly, meeting his gaze, not surprised, not seeking acknowledgement, just receiving the information the same way she approached everything else, with clarity and calm. "It was always meant to be core," she replied, her voice soft but steady, and Ethan nodded once, slower this time, as if accepting not just the correction, but the perspective behind it, and Megan, standing a few feet away, added quietly, "We are also revising review protocols," her tone measured. "No component moves forward without full evaluation, regardless of who built it." And there was a pause after that, not long, but enough for the meaning to settle, because everyone in the room understood what had been implied, what had been overlooked, and what would no longer be ignored, and Ava returned her attention to the screen, her hands resting lightly near the keyboard again, the cursor blinking at the end of a stable line, waiting, but not urgently, just present, and the system continued to run smoothly, each process flowing into the next without resistance. The earlier instability now reduced to memory, to logs that would be reviewed and documented, but not felt again in the same way, and Ethan remained where he was for another second before speaking once more, his voice quieter now, more personal than procedural. "Your position here is not temporary anymore," he said, not loudly, not formally, just clearly enough to be heard, and Ava did not respond immediately, not because she did not understand, but because the words themselves were still catching up to everything that had already been proven, and when she did speak, it was with the same calm that had carried her through every moment before. "I did not stay because of a position," she said, her eyes still on the screen. "I stayed because it mattered." And that was it. No emphasis, no expectation, just the truth placed gently into the space between them, and Ethan exhaled quietly, not in response, but in recognition, while the room around them continued its steady rhythm, screens glowing, systems running, people working, but beneath it all there was something different now, something quieter and stronger, a shift that did not need to be announced because it could be felt in every decision that followed, and Ava remained at her desk within that rhythm, not elevated, not changed in appearance, but fully seen in a way she had not been before, her presence no longer something to overlook, but something the system itself now depended on. The office had returned to its quiet rhythm, but it was not the same quiet as before. It carried memory now, a trace of something learned the hard way, and Ava sat within it, her screen glowing softly in the reflection of the glass wall, lines of stable data moving with calm precision, nothing urgent, nothing breaking, just a system doing what it was supposed to do, and her hands rested lightly near the keyboard, not typing, not rushing, simply present, ready, the cursor blinking at the end of a completed line like a steady pulse that no longer needed attention to keep going. And across the room the team worked with a different kind of focus, slower in some ways, more careful, conversations quieter but clearer, as if each person was listening not just to the system, but to each other, and Ethan stood near the central display, his posture relaxed but his gaze thoughtful, the screens in front of him no longer demanding decisions, just reflecting outcomes, and for a moment he watched the data, then let his eyes shift, not out of habit this time, but with intention, toward Ava, and there was no distance left in that look, no dismissal, no assumption, just recognition, the kind that does not need to be spoken to exist, and he did not interrupt her, did not call her name again, because there was nothing left to ask in that moment. The system was stable, the roles had shifted, and the lesson had already been written in a way that could not be undone, and Ava remained focused on her screen, but there was a quiet awareness in the way she sat, not of being watched, but of being seen, a difference that did not change her movements, did not alter her calm, but settled, somewhere deeper, where it mattered, and after a few seconds she reached forward and typed a final command, not to fix anything, not to correct, but to log the state of the system as it was now, stable, balanced, complete, and the confirmation returned instantly, clean, precise, a simple acknowledgement that everything was holding exactly as intended, and she closed the terminal window slowly, the motion deliberate, unhurried, the glow of the screen dimming slightly as the active process ended. And for a brief moment the reflection on the glass sharpened, her silhouette clear against the soft light of the room, and she picked up her badge from the edge of the desk, straightening it where it had been slightly misaligned earlier. The small gesture quiet, but meaningful. And then she stood, not abruptly, not with any sense of exit or escape, just rising into a space that no longer pushed her to the edge. And as she stepped away from the desk, the system continued to run behind her, smooth and steady, requiring nothing more from her in that moment. And no one stopped her, no one questioned her movement, because there was no longer a need to define her place in the room. It had already been proven, and Ethan watched her take a few steps, then turned his gaze back to the display, the stable lines, the absence of alerts, and he understood something then that had nothing to do with code or systems or protocols. Something simpler and harder at the same time. That what held everything together had never been just the structure they built, but the people they chose to see or not see within it. And the room settled into that understanding without words, without announcement, just a quiet shift that stayed, and Ava walked past the glass wall, her reflection moving alongside her for a moment.